sticks, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Will Miller, a political scientist employed as Executive Director of Institutional Analytics, Effectiveness, and Strategic Planning at Jacksonville University. And with me today is Brian Smikowski, a political scientist at the University of Idaho. Glad to have you back, Brian.
Good to be back, Will.
And this is a great week, I think, for us to obviously get to do the show. We have a lot that we're going to be able to talk about. We'll see how long some of the stories take us versus others. But one thing to obviously start out with this week is the passing of former Supreme Court Justice John Paul Stevens. And Brian, anything you want to share about Stevens or his time or anything memory-wise for our listeners?
Yeah, it was one of those deaths that kind of hits you because, 99 years of age, robust career. And I think pertinent to the program is the fact that sometimes presidents make appointments where they expect them to be their philosophical, ideological, and partisan ally. And sometimes they drift from that. And he's a classic example. He was appointed by Nixon to the Circuit Court in 1970, and after that, he's appointed by Gerald Ford to the U.S. Supreme Court. And, he gets to the Supreme Court unanimously, and he did not serve as a steady conservative voice. In fact, he never really was on the left-hand liberal side of the equation, but it felt that way because when you're coming out of the Earl Warren years and we're watching a court increasingly move bit by bit to the right, he occupied a centrist position. But I think as it relates to some of the big issues of our time, he spoke out in major dissents. These were dissenting opinions a long time ago on gay rights and race-conscious districting, which resonate today when we're having the Supreme Court basically beg off of issues involving districting because it's too difficult or it's sociological gobbledygook. So, his passing is one of those things that, we could occupy a whole program on with regard to his role on a court and ideology, but it's it sort of feeds in a little bit to where we'll be going as we talk about some of the changes with Planned Parenthood and the assertive position that the agency is taking with regard to advocacy in the era when the court is tilting increasingly to the right in a pretty firm position. In
a pretty quick position. I mean, it's funny because you're right. I mean, I think Stevens had a lasting legacy, and I obviously think that for a lot of us on the right, Stevens was always viewed as being away from the left without remembering that historically he was there because of Republican control. Definitely a loss for the court and for jurisprudence in the country. And then outside of our normal show, too, just remember that obviously I want to spend a little bit of time today talking about the fact that it's the 50th anniversary of the moonwalk. And I think that's, again, especially pertinent today, and we could argue any direction we want for that. I'm sure somebody's out there thinking that we might need to figure out how to move to some other planet soon if we keep going with global warming. Or it could be, again, back to the nationalism idea of we need to be the first to Mars or the first to other areas. But in general, I think it's important that we spend a few minutes talking about the moonwalk, its significance in our political history, and just our significance in general in terms of technology and space travel.
Yeah, I agree. I think when we look at this through the lens of history, I was looking at some of the polling data because we have some of these funny Hollywood memories of, from Dumb and Dumber, where it's like, the man walks on the moon. No way, and he's reading it obviously in the 1990s when the movie came out, or the 2000s, whenever it came out. And it seems like through the lens of history, like something that really would have galvanized a society, right? People remember where they were the minute that it happened, and we have these images of people being glued to, black and white broadcast images. But the reality is there really wasn't a ton of support for it, even at the time. Because when you go back and look at some of the Gallup data from the first mission, the Apollo 11 astronauts, who was still in quarantine when they were returning from the moon, and Americans were asked by Gallup about whether they would support funding a mission to Mars, which is really kind of where the conversation is going now. So like, moon, been there, done that. Is it really about going beyond and thinking about a place that we can inhabit for scientific purposes and to accommodate a population that we can't seem to control? back then, 39% were in favor of funding a Mars mission, and 53% were solidly opposed to it. The cost was seen as prohibitive and astronomical. But then
It
we
probably was.
and it definitely is, because when you think about what the costs are now, literally the billions upon billions of dollars to send one mission to Mars, for example, the question is why, right? And we still get these questions that come up about why do we go out there? Is it a pride factor? Is it being first at something and being able to say, look at us, we were the first person to get, a manned presence on another planet? Or is it also about scientific inquiry? And one of the things that I like about the idea of thinking about the future of space travel in light of the 50th anniversary is that a lot of scientific innovation and breakthroughs and curiosity seeking comes from imagining something that seems impossible. When you become complacent and you do the same kind of thing, we have a lot of scientific inquiry and breakthrough on a daily basis. But when you literally push the envelope of what's possible is when you find this great spillover effect in terms of scientific reasoning and in terms of scientific progress. And even guys like Stephen Hawking, quite some time ago were saying we're really going to have to think about a place for people beyond this little blue dot that we've got.
And it's true, but it also just always raises the question to me of not just the so what or what are we getting back. I mean, obviously, I think there is a part of this that's kind of that FOMO experience where we have this fear that somebody's going to beat us there and we're going to learn all about this foreign planet by looking at some country's space mission on Facebook. But I do think there is a legitimate question of not necessarily what do we get out, but what are we doing it instead of? And I think that's an interesting conversation today where, obviously, I mean, if we look at the news cycle this week, outside of what we've seen with Trump and the squad, we've obviously seen a lot about finances and corporations and appropriate profits. We've seen, a Disney heir go back to Disneyland and talk about the unfairness between average worker salaries and what the CEO's making. And then we're talking about taking what that overpaid in their eyes CEO's making, multiplying it by some huge number and saying we're going to spend this much to send this thing to Mars so we can get pictures and see, is there water, are there plants, what's going on, what's happening. And I do have to wonder, again, even coming from the right at this, how do we explain that to a kid who's hungry in foster care tonight? How do we explain that to somebody sleeping at a border shelter? How do we explain that to a homeless vet that, we don't have programs that necessarily take care of you, but don't worry, in 50 years, you can get on a rocket and go to Mars, and we'll try to figure out something there. I still have a hard time finding that, of really drawing the bridge between those two sides. Because, again, there's just such a cost associated with it. And I think you're right. The return is there. It's just that return is by no means immediate. Obviously we've seen the pictures of the Mars rover. It's great. It's beautiful. It's really cool and interesting. But is it doing anything tangible for me today? Not that I've experienced.
Right. And I think one of the responses to that goes back to something that Neil deGrasse Tyson made, which is it's worth it if for no other reason that it galvanizes a generation of students to become scientists, to become engineers, to become mathematicians, basically advocacy for the STEM fields. But
as long as they have textbooks that have been updated in the last 30 years.
Well, yeah, and there's truth to both sides. Like on the one hand, we could say that it's whether you look for the direct or the indirect payback, right? The indirect is that when you have a generation of future astronauts, right? Very few people are going to be there. If you have a generation of people who get inspired by science and you advance scientific reasoning, right? That's pretty huge because, I live in a part of the country where I just went to Whidbey Island, which I didn't know was sort of like the ground zero for the Flat Earth Society. And, there are people that would argue that the world is flat and there is no moon. And if there is, why would we go there anyway? But the reality is, at a time when some of us, I think, fear that we're losing the capacity for meaningful scientific inquiry and informed scientific reasoning, it's good to inspire kids. Now, the other side of it, of course, is that inspiring a kid to become a scientist presumes that you fed a kid to be able to go to school and have a quality enough education. So the cost benefit analysis is hard to demonstrate.
Yeah, it's tough. And again, like you said, I think, and using Neil deGrasse Tyson always helps because it's hard to argue against anything that man says. But the concept of obviously it's going to have that inspirational aspect, and hopefully that encourages students to stay dedicated to school. But I just hope there's support to help them be good in these fields, not just to be interested, not just to use their imagination as small children, but to really become scientists who can help us make positive breakthroughs here. Because obviously, I mean, that longer-term impact's definitely possible. And I don't think we can play down the nationalism aspect here. I mean, if we go back and look what happened 50 years ago, we know that was partially driven by geopolitics.
There's the
take everybody else out
angle.
of this. We're not there.
No, we're not. And, it's one of those things where you could be seen as, are we resting on our laurels that we boldly went where nobody went before and we planted the flag. And what have we done in between? Now, of course, we have a history of accomplishment in between, but what's that big galvanizing thing where we said, hey, look, in this one regard, we really are number one, right? As as a political force, as an economic force, as a scientific force, we went beyond imagining something and we actually did it. There is that. There is also the argument that from in 2008. When Stephen Hawking gave a lecture at NASA's 50th anniversary, he argued that if the human race is to continue for another million years, we'll have to boldly go where no one has gone before, with reference to expanding our reach out into the galaxy. Now, the fact of the matter is, if you say that in the current political climate and say, let's think about life for another million years, we're having a hard time getting people to sit at the table and have a conversation about glaciers. We're having a hard time having people sit down and have a conversation about what life's going to be like for the next generation coming up in 10 years, 20 years, and 30 years.
Well, plus on top of that, I mean, by this focus and discussion on Mars, are we saying we've tapped out the moon already? Is that not an option? Is that not a possibility? I feel like there's still questions there on, the what have we done between now and then. I also have questions about what have we done to fully finish exploration of the moon, or looking at the possibilities there between when we first landed 50 years ago and today.
I wonder if it's societally kind of like when you plan a vacation and you can go back to that great place that you were there before any of your friends were there, and you're anxious to go back. But the question is, why? I've already been there. Let's go someplace else. And is it about the potential for a habitat being more suitable for the human condition in the future on Mars as opposed to the moon, right? I think there's other reasons why we think that way and we think farther. But I do think, back to your earlier point about where you actually sounded pretty liberal, Will, about making sure that the food's on the table. That's a hard and fast reality. That on the one hand we want to inspire kids, and I think sometimes we could look at the scientific breakthroughs that we get through pushing the envelope, and we could look at the inspiration in the eyes of little children who grow up to be scientists, and how scientific curiosity matters so much to our evolution as a species. But we want to do that, but we also want to be able to provide a capacity for quality of education in the K through 12 schools and higher education, and also for the families to be able to nourish the children, to be able to provide for the health care that's necessary to have open minds.
Yeah, no, I mean, I completely agree. And I think it'll be interesting to watch, our continued interest here and what happens with Trump's space ideas, and whoever wins in 2020, whether that's Trump or a Democrat, sort of what direction we take there.
Oh, Space Force One, I forgot about that.
Yeah, Space Force One, theme song,
yeah,
everything.
So
that's an option.
Space Force One. Yep.
But I feel like I'm prolonging this conversation just because of what we're turning to next, but I think it's time. So obviously this week we've seen a lot of political discussion in this country, focusing on race, focusing on the role of the president. Even on our own Facebook page for the Politics Guys, we've seen a lot of back and forth and a lot of real anger. And obviously, I know going into this conversation, no matter what I say, I will walk away from this being labeled a racist, a partisan hack, being anti-American, being anti-female, anti-minority, anti-immigration. So those of you who've already preconceived that that's what I am because I'm not going to sit here and just step all over Donald Trump for the next 20 minutes, feel free to say whatever you want. That's a preset notion. It's not your fault that you're coming into this already feeling that way, and you're going to leave feeling that way no matter what happens. So I've prepared myself for that. But obviously, Brian, I mean, with what's happened this week, the calling out of the squad as directly or indirectly as people want to interpret that, and then the fallout that's come from that, and then the rally that we saw in the middle of the week in North Carolina, and the chance to send her home, and all of this anger and all of this emotion. What's your initial take on it? I mean, obviously, we have a lot of angles we're going to go through here, but when you look at this, what's it make you think? What's it make you say?
I think it's strategic. I think there's sort of there's a question of whether it's improvisational madness, as I saw in something I was reading on Axios this morning. But I think more than that, I think he stumbles into something that resonates with his true feelings on a particular topic. But he also realizes the sales pitch that's associated with it. So I think that Trump's racist tweet, and I think there's no getting around the racism that was buried within it. I think it was very calculated. So he sends the tweet out. Almost immediately afterwards, when questions come up, Kellyanne Conway asks a reporter about his ethnicity. And suddenly it becomes like an okay thing to do, almost like your credibility hinges upon where you're from. And what is the value of that politically? What is the value of that societally? There is no value to that. It's dangerous, in fact, to think of us being a democratic state where we have people questioning one another's ethnicity to determine whether or not they should be even entitled to answer, to ask a question, or to serve. Now, what this does, in my opinion, is this seeks to galvanize that portion of Trump's base that he knows he already has, right? And he wants to build upon it. So he could reach out to an older generation of voters that he's pretty much already got locked down. He could re-solidify some aspects of an evangelical base where this kind of provides a trifecta effect for him heading towards the next election cycle. And from when you look at the Democratic and the Republican responses, and I think this is the most important point, Trump's ultimate strategy was basically to put the bait out there, get the bite on the lure, and then say, look at them, that's the Democratic Party. If you want to think about Democrats, that squad, those four people, that's the Democratic Party. And he builds that base, and we've talked about this before, and I think this is something that we all kind of know. Whether you come at it from the right or the left, we know that Trump's strategy is not to wait for news to be out there and to jump on the news, but to create his own news, to portray Pelosi as the racist one, because Pelosi made the comment about his comments being disgraceful and disgusting and racist, and she made the comment about his campaign really being about making America white again. And immediately Trump switched that around and said, now that's racism. And to his base, there are people who are going to say, yeah, that's racism. To his base, they're going to look at the squad and see the squad as what's wrong with America, not what's right with America. And they're going to see, even within the Democratic Party, for those who follow this and look at this on the left-hand side of the equation, we see a big difference between the squad and the mainstream of the Democratic Party. We see a gap, in fact, between the Democratic Socialist side of that continuum and even the more liberal section of that continuum. But it's definitely not the Democratic Party. But at a moment in time where we've got 20 candidates going on stage again for a debate, and we're still trying to think about what this platform is going to look like, Trump's voters are not going to be waiting for that to materialize. They're going to be saying, it's that. It's all that. It's that squad. Yep.
And I think the strategy's there. I completely agree that this was a strategic decision. And I think the way you framed it is also right with there's racism maybe packed inside of that tweet. Explicitly, it's not racist. To me, there's nothing in there that if I saw that pulled out and just put in front of me and said, is this person racist? With that alone, I don't see racism there. But obviously, as we unpack it and know the history, we can draw these conclusions. And we'll talk, obviously, more about that in focus. But from the strategy standpoint, I mean, when you think about what this has ultimately done, nobody's talking about Siegel right now. Nobody's talking about connections. I think Bill Clinton's also probably pretty happy that this tweet happened. Because I got some pressure off him again. So that's not being discussed. And we've also entered a world now where, to some extent, by labeling everybody that lives in a flyover state that partially thinks they could vote for Donald Trump a racist, what we've really done is given Trump the okay to defend them and actually start saying some things that might be considered even more explicitly racist. If we look at the North Carolina rally held earlier in the week, I mean, what he says about Ocasio-Cortez is more racist than that tweet in my eyes when he mentions that he's just going to call her Cortez because he doesn't have time to use 3 names.
Right.
I mean, that gets more explicit, but that's no longer surprising or shocking.
Well,
there's not as much uproar.
Yeah, there's a lot of racism in there. There's a lot of, sexism in there also about, the portrayal of one's identity with multiple names. And I don't see it the same way as you do, Will, in terms of whether I see racism on the surface or you have to look for it in there. I see the racism, pretty close to, actually being right out there, because he's identifying a category of people who share certain characteristics, and he's making a summary judgment about them and where they may or may not be from with, I would bet, no strand of knowledge about their ethnicity, right? About their places of national origin. But even to go so far as to say...
Totally agree on that. But
to say,
this is about how you look, not what you are.
Yeah, I mean, some of that is, his voters aren't going to be saying, oh, wait a minute, let's actually look and see if she's anti-Semitic. But if they say, well, she's anti-Jewish, or, I can't remember exactly how he put it, the voters are going to go with that because that's going to be the gospel truth to them. But I think there's a short-term and a long-term thing here that I'm absolutely fascinated by when I think about the shifting demographics of the United States. I was looking at some data recently, and by recently I mean, even this morning, right? That when we look at the changes that are going on, one of the things that's not happening is that population is not suddenly slow. Population growth is not suddenly slowing. Population growth still is growing in areas where the Hispanic population is growing rapidly in key states to the Republican Party. So if you look at, for example, even just, Texas and Florida, you can look at the percentages and how they're changing with an upward tick on literally a daily basis in those states with the Hispanic population. And when we look at the estimates and the projections now, when we take the demographic data and we project what's the world going to be like in a year, what's the world going to be like, or the country going to be like in 10 years, the projections right now indicate that next year, as rapidly as next year, the entire under 18 population will be non-white. Within 10 years, the under 30 population will be a majority of non-white citizens. And so I think that this raises, an important question, because right now what we're seeing is, and I've made this argument before, that with the Trump administration, it's like the bullies finally had their day. These were the kids who said, when I get in office and if we ever get a majority and if we ever have our way, we're going to do all these things, right? Knowing that they're probably not going to last. But while you're there, you're going to go full speed ahead to get them. The question is about lasting impact. And when we look at lasting impact, I think it's pretty disastrous for the Republican Party unless they do some political shifting very rapidly. So if we see these shifts in the population base, right, and if we see that right now Trump and this faction of the Republican Party could tap into this reliable constituency to get a minimal winning coalition, and remember, he was up by 20 among white men. What's it like among that non-white population as that shrinks? The long-term prospects for the Republican Party to deal with the shifting demographic nature of our country, I think, is going to be a real challenge. Because as the Hispanic population, for example, just taking that one, grows, what's the message that the Republican Party is going to make to plausibly attract and keep the Hispanic vote intact? Right now, Trump could say these things. But if you're looking ahead even 10 years, it's going to be a real challenge for the Republican Party.
I don't disagree with any of that. I just don't think Donald Trump cares.
No, because it's all about right now.
It's all about right now, and I think that's where Republicans are. And I think a lot of what he managed to do with this is move the Democrats so much further left. I mean, as a Republican, my biggest concern when this tweet broke was I thought Pelosi and Cortez and the rest of the squad, and there I am, Ocasio-Cortez and the rest of the squad, were getting ready to take each other out, and that he played a misstep by giving them a common ally. But instead, we're basically in a situation where Nancy Pelosi now has to defend her bitter inter-party enemy. And that's going to draw them closer because, let's be honest, the squad is not going to be happy unless they try to impeach Trump. And I don't think Pelosi's going down that path. I think we keep seeing these half-hearted, half-assed bills calling for impeachment that don't even get media attention because people know there's no chance they're coming to fruition. And because of that, by actually pushing them closer together, he has helped move centrist Democrats further left.
Yeah, I think it's...
At least in perception.
Yeah. I think you hit on a couple of interesting observations there that, we can unpack them just a little bit. Because, when we think about the squad and the composition of it, I thought it was hilarious, the impact that The Onion has. Remember, throughout history, The Onion has kind of fooled people, and people thought it was legitimate news.
I got to check my Facebook feed every day to be like, crap, is that real or is that The Onion again?
Exactly, right? But, just when was this? Just day before yesterday or so, Bill Pascrell from New Jersey basically sent a tweet out basically saying, well, how about it? Because The Onion made the joke about him wanting to join the squad. So here he is kind of saying, I want to join the squad. Because this is kind of like, to one group, these are the cool kids. These are the ones who are the rebellious ones. To another group and cluster, these are the ones that are distracting from the message of unifying the Democratic Party in order to help secure a victory in the 2020 election, right? So there's the thorn in the side that's actually galvanized a certain part of the Democratic Party. I do think, this is going to be one of those things that it's going to pass in terms of electoral consequences, but it's not going to pass in the minds of people who care about racial divide. It's not going to pass to people who care about social justice. It's not going to pass to people who think about a larger conception of ourselves as a civil society, because stuff broke down, man. I mean, we had somebody basically, instead of dropping a mic and walking away, putting down a gavel and walking away. We had immediately Al Green issuing a privileged resolution to call for impeachment. And now again, if you are in a particular column where these issues are the issues that define the hill upon which you're going to plant your flag and fight, you're going to do that boldly and you're going to do that courageously. But we know what happened with the Democratic response, right? The Democratic response ranged from a formal rebuking of the president to a censure of the president to an impeachment of the president, to an impeachment move under the privilege resolution. Well, the privilege resolution for impeachment failed, and this is kind of a recurring
miserably.
Yeah, and this is a recurring theme of conversations we had in our last broadcast and also over the last couple of years now, Will, which is to the average voter, the Democrats, even Nancy Pelosi is kind of saying, let's stop with and talk about impeachment unless and until we have something that we could really say, we got him, right? Because all it does is feed into the news loop that benefits the other side, that here they go again, here they go again, here they go again. The Democrats can't even get their house together. So for the Republican side of the equation, they don't even have to fight back. They're like, look, even the Democrats aren't down with this, right? And the way Trump will spin that is, they talk about impeachment, but they don't even really want to impeach me. So then it fizzles out and it falls by the wayside. And what this does is, I think it's going to be interesting when we look ahead to the next debate that we have coming up, as we see the candidates trying to distinguish themselves as front runners. How are they going to be defining the party? Who, to a segment now, there's this notion of extreme, radical, leftist, socialist, non-quote-unquote American agitators.
Yeah, and I have to say, you talked about the process breaking down, and the one thing that's really rubbed me this week, listening to the news, reading comments on Facebook stories, listening even comments on articles, listening to call-in shows and NPR, the anger over Nancy Pelosi finding herself in trouble on the House floor for what she was saying about the president, and people, of course, making the long-range argument of, well, how can we not get mad at Trump, but we can get mad at Pelosi for saying these things about Trump? And it's not understanding the rules and procedures. Twitter is its own animal. Mm-hmm. We can say whatever we want on Twitter. It's a different type of speech. There aren't rules and regulations on there saying that these types of implied messages are problematic. So I'm just so tired of people being so blind to both sides that they see theirs, see whatever happens against theirs, and automatically make their choices. And that goes both ways.
Yeah, because one of the arguments that came up was, Nancy Pelosi seek to enforce a rule by breaking a rule, and you can't claim a moral high ground. Now the question is, did she really break a rule? I don't think there's any evidence to say that she broke a rule. She has the authority to be able to bring things up and enter it as a matter of record on a floor in a Capitol building, saying things which are, I think, empirically true. I don't think that anybody would argue that what he said, well, no, I'm going to scrub that because I'm sure somebody's going to immediately say, I'd say that. But really, I think it is disgraceful when a president says, basically the love it or leave it argument, when the president makes accusations, when a president has things that even have a tinge of racism associated with it. There's something disgraceful about a lot of how Trump, I would say virtually everything that Trump does have a modicum of disgrace associated with it. He's taken us down on a race to the bottom of the barrel where anything is fair game. And we've normalized things that historically haven't been normalized. So I think to a normal, rational person like myself who comes at it from the left, and that's my definition of normal and rational, is that it was disgraceful, that it was disgusting, that it was racist. And I think it would be hard to argue against that, especially when you take the message and you couple it with the people about whom it was said. And I think that she had the right to be able to say that and for it to remain as a matter of record.
Yeah, and again, I mean, it's just the position and the rules. It's just, to me, I still look at what the Democrats are doing in general. And it's that question of, you're going into an election, you're still trying to impeach somebody that only helps his base rally around him. And you're basically telling anybody who supports him that they're sexist, homophobic, and racist, and then being like, why are you voting for him, you sexist, racist, homophobe? Vote for one of our candidates. And at the end of the day, I'm not going to stand up and say that I like what Donald Trump said or what he's done over the last week or over the course of his lifetime. I don't like all of it. But you know what I do like? I like lower taxes. I like less regulated government. I like somebody who's willing to reach out to foreign leaders that we haven't talked to in decades or lifetimes. I like secure borders. I like the idea of immigration being legally curbed in a way that protects Americans. And at the end of the day, when I look at the Democratic field, there's nothing there for me with that yet.
You see, I would go toe-to-toe with you on all those observations because I think the economy has the illusion of performing successfully because for a category of people who are fairly well off, they're doing extremely well. For people who are entering the labor force, they're not doing as badly. But if we look at things involving race and gender and economic justice, there's still a colossal gap that exists there. And I think this is sort of when we start thinking about the Democratic candidates on the issues of the economy. This is obviously where people like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren are going to come up as the Democratic icons. I understand your point about having secure borders, but then we have the testimony that's gone on this week before Congress about the treatment of individuals on our southern border. We have the question that comes up, as you mentioned it, about forging relationships with other nations to strengthen those bonds. Yet we have a colossal issue going on with China right now that could potentially destabilize segments of the American political economy. Right? I mean, the Chinese economy would endure and thrive much more effectively than the American economy would right now because the Treasury is held so much by China. And the reason why they're not going to play their Trump card is because it would hurt them. So I think, on all these issues, and I think this is the healthy thing about a discussion like this, Will, is that if you look at it from either side, we can look and say, hey, look, there are people who are employed who previously were not employed. However, we still have a wage gap. We could look and say that there's a category of people who are climbing the rungs of the ladder of success, but we could also look and say that there's not economic justice in the United States. We can look and say that, security of a nation is a paramount concern, but yet the security and the stability of the border is still separating families and having people living in squalor, right? So I think that the debate, if we were to extract all of the drama, and if we took away Twitter, and if we took away Trump, and if we took away, the hard topics as presented in a way that really makes us dig in our heels on our sides, what we're seeing is, a really fertile ground for a very robust conversation about what is the actual state of health of the economy? What is the state of health with regards to security? What is the state of our relationships on a global plane? Because I think they're in a more perilous place than a promising place right now.
Yeah, and again, I mean, I think that's a fair assertion and a fair pushback on it. It's just, again, coming from the right, it's looking at it and saying, taxes are down. And I'll just take it to one issue. And I guarantee you, out of those 20 people standing on stage in Detroit, if forced to ask, all 20 are going to say they're raising taxes. They're going to have to do half of what they're talking about. And just in general, I look at everything you just mentioned as being at that really important point in history where we figure out what's going to work and what's not going to work. I mean, the idea of democracy is there too. Other things I've seen on social media this week are people going back to Donald Trump lost the popular vote by 3 million votes. He did. Donald Trump was democratically elected. You may not like the style of democracy. You may not like the system that got him there, but it was democratically done. And to try to argue otherwise is just showing that we have people that are just clawing at any little desperate rung to try to bring their side back to the lead here. And again, that's both ways. That's not just Democrats doing it to Trump. We have plenty of Republicans really digging in over this stuff. I mean, I've even seen the old John Adams quote thrown around a bunch in recent days, all about how government isn't for a rich class and a rich family or one person. And I sit there and I just laugh at that every time, because if you've ever read John Adams' life work, the man was brought into privilege, became president just because of George Washington, and ensured that his son would eventually follow and be president too. So, I mean, it's just so ironic that we keep pulling and we don't even bother looking at context. And a lot of people brought up a really good point this week, that almost what we're feeling here is the same problems that emerged when the Tea Party was on the right pushing the same way against Obama. And there were even Republicans during that saying, this is not the way to go. Jesus, what are we doing? And now we're sitting there, and I think there are folks on the left that are saying, this is not the way we need this fight to happen. If we want to take advantage, Brian, of all those long-term demographic impacts you've talked about, because otherwise we just end up in a scenario where the political system as a whole ends up broken. I mean, for the love of God, I found the first candidate I'm going to donate to for the next election cycle this week, and I don't even know her name. I just know she's running against Ocasio-Cortez and has a chance. And I'll figure out her name later. But that's where we've come to, is where this vitriol politics has come into play. And I'm as guilty of it as anybody, as I just confessed. I don't want AOC to win, and I'll do whatever I can to help somebody beat her. And that just happens more and more, and that's not a good reason to vote for somebody.
If you're going to be negative, Will, leave the country. Sorry, that was too easy.
Go home?
Right. Yeah, go back to wherever you came from, right?
We can all go home in that case.
Right. But I think that there's, in what you said, what we do societally is we cherry pick. I mean, I still dabble in constitutional law questions, and I'm always astonished by the people that will cherry pick their favorite quote and miss the larger context. I'm still astonished by, things that I'm like, doesn't anybody read anymore? Did you read the full sentence? Did you read the whole paragraph? Did you read the whole ruling? Did you read the whole book, right? Do you understand the moment in history? No, exactly. We don't. And in fact, some of the, one of the responses during, when some Republicans were asked how they responded to Trump's tweet, one of the responses ranged from, we're the party of Lincoln. Well, what the hell does that mean? I mean, I know what the message is, but it's really out of context, right? It's just trying to shift it back to something which says, hey, if you're going to make an accusation about race, remember that Lincoln was a Republican, and we've got this long history. So, don't throw stones.
Oh, Lord. We're going back to the Democrats and Martin Luther King here, it feels like.
Yeah, so it's we're at a dirty place. But then again, in light of your observation, Will, about understanding historical context, we can't kid ourselves into thinking that politics used to be clean and it suddenly got dirty. It's not. We both lived in the Midwest for a while and very close to the land of Lincoln. And when you go to the museum, you see even the political advertising that was just absolutely so brutal. We could look back to Thomas Jefferson's tenure as president and the years preceding it. Muckraking and digging up dirt on opponents and not being too concerned about consequences is older than we would like to acknowledge. We romanticize the past and think we used to be better than this. We were always pretty bad. Right.
Yep.
It's how we selectively
it's just
pull from
amplified.
History. Yeah. I will say this, though, that it's always been bad, but it hasn't been like this. The Trump administration has introduced a new vocabulary and a new style that historically has been at variance with how sitting presidents um, behave, except for maybe Goldwater in '68 on
Yep.
the issue of race.
Yeah. And again, I mean, I think the really interesting part to end this for me is we sit there and we talk about how we like to change and grow and develop, and we learn from mistakes. And even outside of the stuff with Trump this week, I mean, I'm sitting here all week watching people talk about whatever the Facebook app is called that gives you the old person pictures of yourself. And I'm looking at this, I'm like, I have so many friends that I know are anti-Trump, anti-Russia, we can't collude. And they're basically just handing over photographs of themselves to the Russians, almost daring them to do as they wish with it. So it's one of those where I'm like, as a society, we say we want to grow and develop, but at the end of the day, we want to do what's comfortable. And we see a lot of comfortableness right now. And the thing that concerns me the most about Trump's tweet storm over the weekend is that allows for a level of comfort with things that people will take a different way than Donald Trump is presenting them himself. Meaning that I am worried about now what a 30-year-old man sitting at home in some random state now thinks is okay to say or do or think based on the fact that it is in line with the views of his president.
And I think that's where you and I really agree, despite, ideological differences. I think we all agree with the normalizing tendency that what used to be hidden beneath rocks and stones is now, and we've seen this with terrible consequences, right? It's more visible. It's more proudly displayed. It's more out there with almost a permission slip to say, our president validates this. And you have, people on the far right who are upset with Trump because, he didn't go far enough with the message. And you're like, okay, now we're entering into some really, dangerous waters. Because I think at the core of it, and to sort of wrap this part of it up on a really, I think, a kind way, is that most Republicans and most Democrats and most liberals and most conservatives really don't harbor racist, sexist views. That we have to remember that some of these ideas and some of these behaviors, as reprehensible as they are, don't apply to the average person. But it brings out a segment that's visible, a segment that's real, a segment that's mobilized, a segment that helps secure a base that the Democratic Party is going to have a really difficult time unseating.
Absolutely. We might as well stay on this sort of topic to a degree and talk about Barr and Ross and their contempt charges that came down this week related to the census question. Again, it feels like a lot more political gamemanship. It feels like it's an attack on a symptom, not an attack on the actual disease or what's being perceived as a disease. I mean, from your view, what do these contempt charges mean? What do you think comes from them? Is this meaningless? What about the census question to that extent? I mean, do you think this is actually done, or do you think we still have more to debate and hear about?
I think the census question is, for all intents and purposes, dead and buried at this juncture. There was the issue between the administration and the Supreme Court, where the court's pretty much we spoke on this issue, right? There seems to be a clear sense of responsibility between the three branches of government, trying to get a question on there for the purposes for which it was seemingly intended. It didn't happen, if for no other reason than logistics, right? It never made it on there. So for the Democrats to go after Ross and Barr, I think it was not just low-hanging fruit, but it was a pair of individuals that you couldn't not get the result that they wanted out of this. You couldn't not get the contempt charges filed. Now the question is, and we talked about this last time, it's so what? In the grand scheme of things, so what? I think the closest we come to the answer to the so what question is that Wednesday's vote basically gives authority to the oversight panel to take Barr and Ross to federal court to enforce subpoenas for the materials that are in question. In other words, this brings up the likelihood of criminal law being used for people who are, high-ranking officials during this administration's tenure. And things like this have come up before. I mean, well, actually once, right? Eric Holder during Obama's administration, in his tenure as Attorney General, was brought up for criminal prosecution. But Barr and Ross, I just think it's a lot more like political drama. And I think when we separate ourselves from it for just a minute, if we went out and did one of those person on the street interviews and said, "Who's Ross? Who's Barr?" Nobody would know. Nobody would
care.
Know. Yeah. But the thing is, like, even before they got to caring, they wouldn't even know.
And right? If they did know, it's probably because they're anti-Trump or pro-Trump and looked this up and kind of learned this just to make sure they could argue their side.
Yeah. And in a grand scheme of things, like, what's going to happen as a consequence of this? Is it going to be material that comes out? And this goes back to the conversation about the Teflon Don situation, right? That even if you get this, it's like looking again for the smoking gun. And where the smoke does not necessarily fire, because even if they say, "Oh, look, yes, there was some interesting intent that the president had by including those questions into the census," but it didn't happen. It didn't succeed. And to the public, it's going to be a so what issue. And, I think the public appetite for some of these things is pretty much beyond its expiration point.
Especially in this one, I think. Because, again, when it comes back to that census question, the only concern about the census question was that it was Donald Trump wanting it included. Let's be honest. I mean, the census question has been around. The citizenship question on census documents, on the community survey, on the long form of the census has been around for a while. Right. Obviously, it wasn't on the short form when it came about, so not most households were seeing it, but it was still there. So the question itself is benign. It's the use of the question that was really being, invoked here. And I just think, again, it reflects where we are in terms of paranoia, right or not right, and just how we view how information is going to be used, how we view surveys, how we view polls. I mean, I was looking this week on Thursday, looking at the American National Election Study that's coming out with its next wave, and they've started asking questions to figure out who's cheating or who's trying to cheat when answering a survey by putting in all of these just random Supreme Court cases and asking people if they know what year the cases were decided. Geer versus Connecticut in 1986, I think that was the case that was on that I looked at today. You're the constitutional scholar, and that says something right there. But their basic idea is if you're willing to cheat on this, the rest of your answers are probably either invalid or you've been driven there by somebody. So it just reflects this societal piece that's tough to put our finger on.
Yeah, and I think, we know some people who are really good at this polling in a digital age kind of stuff, and I think that'd be really a great episode to focus on right now, because it's almost like radar and radar detection, and it's almost like, gotcha politics has invaded every part of the political and social landscape, whether it's in the media, whether it's in polls, whether it's in the census. It's, how can data be used? And this is one of the big questions with big data too, right? Is that if you have a big enough data set, and if you have all the controls that are built in, you could select if you way through an instrument in order to be able to get what you want and invalidate responses based upon the results that you get. Which brings me back to, I think when you made the comment that you made earlier about, what's the purpose of all of this? I was thinking about Jim Jordan of Ohio, who's the top-ranking Republican on the oversight panel. And he said literally almost what you said, Will, which is, why are they doing this? Why are they doing this? All because they don't want a simple question on the census. This resolution is ridiculous and we should vote it down. Now, he could have actually stopped before he got to the all because they don't want a simple question on the census, and just have it stopped at why are they doing this? Why are they doing this? Because to the average voter, the question is, what is the purpose and what is the value of this? And if it is to say that the data could be used in a way that could minimize the voting rights of a specific category of voters, that's a hugely important issue. So if there was something really there, then if there would be material evidence that could be produced that would say that this was part of an orchestrated effort by the White House using Barr and using Ross in order to systematically disenfranchise categories of voters from offsetting the election in a way that could have benefited the Democratic Party, then that is a smoking gun. Then that is real. Then that is really bad. And I think that's the question, which is what's kind of at the heart of the eligibility of individuals to vote.
Yep, absolutely. Let's switch and do one last quick story again on the politically charged nature. On Thursday, we saw Interim Secretary McAleenan testify before the House on conditions at border facilities, border holding facilities, which has obviously been a hotbed political issue. It's also been a social media wreck this week for me as I've had to watch all of the AOC memes as people cry at different fences and borders. And then we obviously had Mike Pence actually going down and confirming a lot of what we were hearing from Democrats and kind of depoliticizing part of this and making this more of a humane issue. I'll personally start by saying that I felt what McAleenan was talking about during these hearings was not the sexiest I would have expected. It wasn't as back and forth. It wasn't as revealing. Instead, it felt very much like a plea to Congress to do something so this stopped being an issue. I think his basic defense was the conditions wouldn't even be a debatable point if you all could work together to come up with immigration reform that actually makes sense and solves some of these problems. And again, I don't think there's any question. Some of the things that were being described are terrible and terrifying. I will say that some of the Democrats who went to the border didn't help by using hyperbole and exaggeration, AOC being the main offender. And I also think we saw the politicalization of the border with, wannabe dreamer presidential candidates like Tim Ryan showing up and thinking, my God, I might go from 3 voters to 4 if I do this, and really taking away the power of what they're seeing because of political purpose. But it's clear this is an issue that needs to keep being talked about. But what did you think about the testimony, and what do you think about what's happening at the border and how we address that?
If I were to look at it as a TV show, I'd say, oh, man, it wasn't really very exciting. I think that when we separate out the testimony, I think you're exactly right. That when you have the Department of Homeland Security testifying before Congress, and his point is not really, he kind of actually shifted the focus to where he's looking for a durable solution to the crisis, and that ultimately lies with Congress. And he did bring up issues involving the perceived hyperbole from the other side. And I don't think anybody's denying the fact that the conditions are deplorable. I think the question is what's the value of, is there hyperbole? What's the value of politicizing it when, if we step back for just a moment, we find people on the left and on the right who are basically saying conditions are simply not appropriate? Because when we look not only at the testimony that came out during this week, and we look back at, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's, passionate testimony about her perception of what's happening at the border. And we looked at the DHS Inspector General Jennifer Costello's report that said that, the border needs immediate assistance to address acute and worsening crises that involve overcrowding. I think that there's actually a middle ground that's easy to find. And then when a vice president basically says, tough stuff. I mean, that was really a uniquely evasive way of addressing it, but it was a way of, I think clearly you could see in Pence's message that, when you proclaim that something is, quote unquote, tough stuff, it's a way of acknowledging that it's bad, but that it's a trickier situation, but it needs to be resolved. I mean, the conditions at the border, I don't think anybody's going to say, oh, it's fine, leave it alone, right? Something's got to be done.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, again, I think with Pence, and I know a lot of listeners are not going to agree with this, there is a more of a humanitarian element there. And I think with Pence, you saw a little bit of that, where while this is a political issue, I think his visit and his comments and his demeanor afterwards sort of suggested this made me uncomfortable, and we need to remember that while this could be a pawn in our game of chess, this is also directly impacting some human beings in a pretty real way.
Yeah, and I think that that's an area where, when I was observing and reading transcripts and looking at interview responses, I kept coming back to some common denominators that, aside from the fringiest of the fringe elements, the left and the right both agree that the conditions are not acceptable and overcrowding is having an impact, and something needs to be done. And the DHS leadership's response effectively was, in a nutshell, Congress has a responsibility and a right to do something, come up with a durable solution, and it's not about building bigger spaces. It's about coming up with more impactful public policies. And I think here's where the right and the left would disagree, because the right's argument would be we would take that testimony for a durable solution to the crisis to mean coming up with a harder line on immigration. The Democratic response would be we don't need a harder line on immigration. We just need a more appropriate and humane way of dealing with the process.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that'll continue to obviously come up and be discussed as this issue doesn't seem anywhere near a close.
Nope.
Well, as soon as Brian and I are done recording this show, we'll be doing our special supporters exclusive show. This week, we'll be talking about the 9/11 worker bill in the Senate and Rand Paul and Mike Lee's actions there. We'll be talking about Planned Parenthood, and then also very briefly probably about the trade war impact on both China and the United States. If you're a supporter, that should be in your podcast app by the time you hear me talking about this. That's just one of the supporters' only things we've got for you. To become a supporter or to find out more, check out our Patreon page, patreon.com/politicsguys. Or you can go to politicsguys.com/support. If you have questions, comments, corrections, random thoughts you want to share with us, you can reach us at mail@politicsguys.com. After the discussion about Trump and racism, I am sure that there will be a lot of comments coming, either there or on the Facebook page, facebook.com/politicsguys page, and we're on Twitter at politicsguys. Subscribing to the show really helps us out, as does sharing episodes. Word of mouth is the best advertising we get, and we obviously appreciate everything that everyone listening does for us. Leaving reviews and ratings on whatever podcast app you use also helps. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Bruce Johnson, Wilmer Moreno, Andra Masker, and Benji Fishman. Today's show is produced by Will Miller. We'll be back with a new show on Wednesday, and we hope you'll join us then. Thanks.